So back at the workshop, we've made some initial changes to the setup of the bike, which are all going to help in terms of mastering the trail, regardless of your budget. One of the things that has changed over the years is bike geometry.
What we're looking at is, as bikes have got more set up and working around the rider, the angles are slackened off. So on this bike, the head tube's a little bit steeper, as is the seat tube. It just pushes me that little bit further forward, whereas on Richard's bike, all the angles are that little bit more relaxed, pushing him back into the bike and just making the ride feel a little bit more compliant.
That compliancy has been driven by the types of trails people are riding from an earlier stage and where the market is in terms of the riding people do. Back in the day, your mountain bike was a vehicle for kind of rambling on wheels across a wider range of terrain. As mountain biking's developed, a lot more people are riding steeper terrain earlier or want to experience more technical terrain from the outset, and parks, trail centres are all set up to cater for that. So with favourable geometry becoming more the norm, even on an entry-level bike set up with slightly slacker angles, it's easiest for us to stay in the pocket. From the pocket we can drive energy through the bike. We keep ourselves as the under-rotating mass and therefore the bike as the accelerating mass, which is crucial when it comes to staying in the right place on the bike regardless of what the trail throws at you.
We're looking at the centre line. So on this bike, if I put the centre line through the middle of the bike, with the stem here, it just pulls me slightly further forward, moving that centre line just a little bit further forward on the bike than it would be, say, on Richard's bike. We're then looking at the horizontal centre line, top to bottom, and with that front to back, top to bottom, we can set up that crosshairs so we know what position we want to be in. As we looked at in the workshop, if the saddle's too high, then we can't get into the pocket, so lowering the saddle opens up that position and also enables us to move back behind that centre line and below the top to bottom centre line, getting into the pocket there, making the bike work, as we'll see when we're out on the trail.
Correctly positioning yourself on the bike in the pocket is going to make your suspension work as it's designed to, rather than fighting against you. It's also going to make us able to deal with any stalling effects on the trail. Anytime the bike tries to slow down, our body mass will drive energy and accelerate the bike, and it's going to help us deal with gradient more quickly and easily.
Being in that place on the hardtail just means that without suspension, I'm reliant more on making sure the bike accelerates, because if it does stall or stop, or if I get pulled forward by the bike on the terrain, I'm going to have to work a lot harder to stay back into that position and make the bike work for me.
It's not just the effect of the trail slowing the bike down, but also our ability to accelerate the bike via pumping, which is important when it comes to positioning ourselves in the pocket. So we'll go off and hit the trail. We'll look at a few common trail features, some stalling effects. We'll look at some routes and more uneven sections of trail. We'll look at opportunities for pumping and how we can drive energy through the bike and keep the bike moving, and look at the all-important factor of how to find traction when your bike doesn't bend to the shape of the trail to keep your tyres nice and levelled on the ground, and work out how we can be a bigger driving force in the bike than technology. So looking front on, you'll see one of the bigger differences between an older school bike or an old bike and a newer bike is the width of the bars. The width of the bars, slightly wider, gives me more control. The reason it gives me more control is because if I move my hands just a centimetre on this bar, as opposed to a shorter bar, it affects the wheel less. And when I'm trying to control the kick of the wheel as it hits things, I've got more time. The steering is effectively slowed down. So the inputs are less jerky and snappy, and I've got more time to respond. So a wider bar, when the wheel gets pushed around, gives me that extra control. Back in the day, the advice was get your elbows out and forwards. Essentially, the forwards bit we don't really like to think about too much, because that starts to rotate us too much forward on the bike and brings us into becoming the accelerating mass. But the width aspect of bringing your elbows out on a narrow bar is going to give you that extra stability. So when you get forces in, you can control it more. Tuck your elbows in, and it's far easier for the wheel to get pushed around than you to respond and react to the terrain as the inputs come into the bike.
The other thing you'll find is with the narrower bar, you're more tempted to pull on the bar to steer than you are to push. With the wider bar, you'll find yourself pushing through the bike a lot more, and it's one of those upgrades that really makes a big difference. Today we're with these, so we're going to see how we can make things work out on the trail.
So when it comes to a steeper section, this is where we're really going to notice that difference in geometry from old school to new school. Certainly we're going to have to do more in the way of our body positioning to make sure we stay in the pocket. We're going to have to sink deeper in the pocket to overcome the changes in geometry. The other option, of course, is to adjust our golden thread, which we looked at last issue, whereby different machines and different skill levels are going to allow you to take a different line down a trail. And what's good for me might not be so good for Ian. In this instance, what's quickest for me and smoothest for me might not be an option on a bike or for a rider of different calibre.
Yep.
So as I ride into this, automated dropper down, nice and quick, enabling me to open up that pocket and drop it into it quick. It's really nice and simple for me to roll down this steeper section without too much anticipation building up, or any tightening, any death gripping of the bars, and any of the negative effects that having a slightly overly challenged emotional state can bring. Whereas Ian's option is option B, which is to still make sure he stays in the pocket on a bike with a steeper head angle, but take a slightly less steep line in. Net result is we get to the same place at the same speed, but just adjusting our riding slightly for the bike we're riding without necessarily having to walk around a section.
As Richard was saying, one of the things there is that what I'm looking to do is to feel the bike's going to work underneath me. Coming into the steeper sections on this longer bike, just pushing me that little bit forward, all just starts to make me think a little bit more about what I'm doing rather than letting me think ahead on the trail. And so as important as the line is where I'm thinking, and if I can think through that section, make it a little bit easier for myself to get round, I can get through the section and be off and away without having to do too many changes.
So with a bike with a steeper geometry, steeper head angle on it, and less slack, that doesn't push us back into the pocket, to ride the steeper line, Ian's got a couple of options. One is to get that saddle a little bit further out the way to open up that pocket to enable him to sink into it more easily, and the second is to be a little bit more proactive and start moving sooner than I would on a more relaxed bike. So you don't have to take the route around the steeper section if it is your golden line and your golden thread to come down the steeper section. You just have to put a bit more into it yourself, a bit more view in the equation, and rely a bit less on the tech. Nose right. So you can see that by Ian adjusting his body position sooner, being more proactive, the steeper angles on the bike don't necessarily make that section impossible or above his level of emotional control. He's still staying relaxed, he's still breathing through the section, nice and flexible, nice and fluid. There's a certain autobiography out there that explains it's not about the bike, about the only true thing that bloke said in the last 20 years, but it is true, it's not all about the bike. So getting into the pocket and staying there can be a bit more challenging depending on the angles of the bike. The next thing we're going to look at in terms of ease of making the most out of is pumping energy out of the trail by using energy management pumping. It's a common skill to generate speed down a trail without pedaling, to utilise the trail to drive the bike, but again, on a bike that's more rigid and the suspension works less for you, two sides to this coin. One is that the bike doesn't flex as much, obviously. A little bit of movement at the front end, none at the back. That means you're going to have to time your pump ever so much better. But when you do time your pump well, to match it to the transitions in the trail, all the energy you put in is going to turn into speed. On my bike, yes, it's a bit more flexible, so I can effectively create a false transition as I start my pump. If I mistime it, the bike starts to bend. As I get into the transition, my weight drops down and through the bike, accelerating it. Makes it easier to pump in terms of timing, but obviously some of that force is lost in the bike bending rather than turning into straight line speed.
As Richard said, if you get the pump right on a hardtail, you get all of that feedback. The bike really works for you. The key thing is again, making sure that you're following through the trail rather than pumping into it. It's really easy to get it wrong, but when you get it right, it's really rewarding.
Let's just have a little look as we spin through here. My timing won't need to be as precise, but my output won't be as great. Ian, if he nails the timing on pumping through those transitions and pumping down the trail, will get more from his pump than I will, but it's going to be harder for him to achieve. So it's not impossible. Again, it's just sharpening those skills. You ride a hardtail for 6 months or even 3 months or 3 weeks, it's going to really improve your timing on the trail in terms of working those transitions. When you jump back on a full suspension bike, if you've got one, yes, it's still going to bend a bit as you pump, but your timing is going to be more precise.